Book 1, The Forest at the Edge of the World, Chapter 14. Keep a closer eye on this one. Mari had him right where she wanted him. Perrin, the other night when we were talking, you started to say something about the administrators. The spark in his eyes dimmed. So? You don't entirely trust them, do you? His eyes softened, but the spark didn't return. The army and the government rarely see eye to eye. You have enough history books on your shelves to know that. I'm not talking about the past, Perrin, she said with sweet determination. I'm talking about now. He searched her face. I haven't told you yet, but you are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. And I'm not just saying that because I want you to marry me, he said. You're truly exquisite. He slipped his thick fingers through her light brown hair, gently twisting the ends around. Your little nose, those incredible pink lips, your green, gray eyes? But there's some brown. Your eyes. So desperate he was to avoid discussing the administrators that he was about to attempt, Mari suspected and feared, poetry. Your eyes remind me of a field of green after a rainstorm, when the mushrooms pop up, all brown and beige, those poisonous ones, the ones that... He must have noticed her mouth twisting in amusement. He sighed in exasperation. Clearly, I'm not skilled in romantic talk. Fortunately for you, neither am I, she laughed. Comparing a woman's eyes to lethal fungus? He smirked. So exactly what color are your eyes? Might as well ask me the color of the sky. Well, anyway, he tried again in his attempt to sidetrack her. You must have turned many men's heads over the years. They just couldn't turn yours. And for that, I'm most grateful you think me perfect. You're perfect for me. Thank you, she blushed. She recognized his diversionary tactic, although he did seem sincere about his compliments, and she enjoyed his flattery. Besides, it gave her an idea. She'd read a few silly love stories when she was a teenager, trying to understand her friends and their longings for admirers. Most of the secretive tales were slid from girl to girl under desks, where teachers wouldn't notice, and were so sappy that she was surprised the well-worn pages weren't stuck together from the goo. She'd taken to skimming pages of uncomfortable details, hoping her eyes would fall on something interesting or even useful, but she was always disappointed. But it was strange how bits and pieces of things she really didn't want to read were the parts that were so difficult to purge from her memory. And yet, she considered, a couple of those bits just might come in handy right about now. That someone like you would even notice someone like me, she sighed. Can I do something I wanted to do the very first moment I saw you? Perhaps, he said slowly. Depends on what that is. Well, at first, I wanted to hit you with a stick. You wouldn't have been the first female. He rubbed the faint scar on his forehead. Really? And what did you compare her eyes to? They weren't like yours, all brownish gray with green and bits of gold like straw, he tried again. I think you just described the colors of horse manure, Mari decided. His face lit up. Yes! He realized his mistake a second too late. I mean, no! But Mari was already laughing. The effect you have on women. Perrin growled quietly, but smiled. I do believe her eyes were blue. All the more reason you insulted her by declaring her eyes to be the color of manure. His growling grew louder. I didn't... Oh, he gave up before trying. Go ahead and believe I have no influence with women. Mari had a worrying thought. She, wasn't pretty, was she? The lines around his mouth did the closest thing possible to a swagger. What would you expect from a girl who falls for me? But I must confess she was quite unappealing. Of course, what kind of a judge of beauty was I when I was only 11? Mari didn't mean for her relief to come out in such a loud exhale. He chuckled. Weren't you about to do something a minute ago? He reminded. Oh, yes. What I really wanted to do at that first debate was this. Satisfied that her only competition was 17 years ago, she slowly ran his fingers through his black hair. He closed his eyes partway. And here I thought Hogel was being silly about my not wearing my cap. Anything else you wanted to do? Actually, she blushed again as she stroked some of the short hairs on his neck. Do you remember that second Holy Day meeting? I purposely sat a few rows behind you. His eyes opened. Oh, I remember. I was watching for you to come in until Hogel mentioned that you were already behind me. I did that on purpose, she confessed. I didn't want you to see me turning red whenever you looked at me. I love watching you blush. He slid a finger over her cheek. That's why I started winking at you. Gave me hope that maybe you thought of me as much as I thought of you. And here I was hoping you hadn't noticed the effect you had on me. Oh, I noticed, he said earnestly. So what about that Holy Day meeting? I swear I could feel you staring at my neck. She grinned. I have no idea what Hogel talked about that day. Actually, I was staring at this. She ran her finger over the curve of his ear. His eyes closed partway again. Anything else, Miss Pato? Yes. She leaned in closer until she breathed gently on his ear. She never thought she would have been grateful to remember a few painfully awkward passages from How to Sway a Boy in 6 Simple Steps. Perrin's eyes closed completely and goosebumps rose on his neck. Mari almost smirked. Well, what do you know? The stories were correct. He was quite literally swaying. I also wanted to say this, she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear in accordance with step 5. Yes, he breathed in anticipation. She couldn't remember step 6 anymore, but she didn't need it. I recognized your diversionary tactic, Captain, so I'll try something else. She kissed his soft earlobe. More goosebumps. Tell me, Perrin, what does your father think about the administrators? His throat gurgled as if he were being strangled. Mari pulled away and smiled sweetly. Perrin blinked, exhaled, as if to jar himself from wherever his mind had been. Yes, definitely not an interrogation technique my father ever considered. Mari, that was just cruel. Interrogation. Maybe women should be in the army, she mused. Not you, he pointed at her. You shouldn't mess with the man's mind like that, giving my thoughts whiplash. Well, she ran her hand along his solid neck. He rubbed his forehead and groaned. Mari, you don't need to worry about any of that. The condition of my civilization, the attitudes of my future husband and father-in-law towards our leaders. Next, you'll say something inane like, don't trouble your exquisite little head with such details. He smiled partially. You're something else, you know that. How could I fall in love with anything less? Again, thank you, I think. She furrowed her brows, wondering what something else meant. But Perrin, she shifted into debate form, when you came over last night, you said you would be honest with me and everything from now on. We're here tonight trying to be sure this union will succeed. And if you begin by going back on your previous declaration of honesty, how can I trust anything else you tell me? I'll be honest with you first. Until a few weeks ago, I believed the administrators truly were making great strides in improving the world. But then you told us about the suggestions in education. That struck a bit close to home for me. It may be silly, but I've always loved debating about the color of the sky. It's far more than an exercise in assumption and observation. So now that the administrators are suggesting that we don't need to teach how to observe, even now my belly is clenching at the idea, and I'm not sure why. If you have any light to shed on my discomfort, I'd like to have it. He paused. Mari, he eventually whispered, my father is trying very hard to keep civility in our world. For me to express to you anything he suggests would... He hesitated again. He's the High General, Mari. There are certain things that must be kept in confidence. Do you trust me, Perrin? Of course. With everything? Because I can't go into a marriage knowing you're keeping secrets from me. Important secrets. I don't believe in that. He pursed his lips as he considered, and she was so tempted to kiss him that she did. He chuckled as she pulled away. You have a point, he said, and incredible influence over me. But don't let anyone know that. All right? I understand your feelings about secrets, but you also must understand my position in the army. How do you feel about hints? Hints, she said, suspicious. These are negotiations, Mari, he reminded her. One side gives a little, then the other side gives a little. You need to meet me halfway on this. Are hints all I might get? It's to protect you, Mari, not aggravate you. He became startlingly sober. If you know too much, you're vulnerable. I already love you too much to put you in danger. Can you accept that? She was so thrilled at the way he readily confessed, I already love you too much, that for a moment she didn't register the rest of his sentence. Her startled mind caught up a few seconds later. Danger? All right, I guess I can accept that. Perrin nodded once. He sends me weather reports. She frowned at the odd sentence. He smiled. Specifically, the color of the sky. Really? She beamed. I think I like your father already. Good, because not a lot of people do. The citizens still have the wrong impressions about the army. My grandfather, Per, was a remarkable man, he said with genuine admiration. He cleaned house when he took over as High General and even reined in some of the tendency of Quarrel III's very threatening widow. But that family worried that the world would embrace the army more than they appreciated the king's leadership. So they spread rumors. Despite my grandfather's efforts and now my father's, the army is still seen as something to be feared. But Mari, I promise you, danger does not come from the army, he said meaningfully. And while they all respect him, very few people appreciate my father, especially a particular former professor. Ah, Mari said, understanding his allegations. Wasn't he your professor as well? Perrin nodded. He doesn't have the best of feelings toward me either. You know how I love to debate. When I was younger, I wasn't as disciplined as I am now. You think you're disciplined now? She teased. He laughed. Okay, more than I was. As a 21-year-old, well, let's just say I was well known, and not in the best of ways. Nico Mal doesn't believe in debating, only in shutting down and humiliating. Well, I don't believe in being shut down or humiliated, as you've discovered. It was not the best of combinations, but the class was never boring. Mal and I bickered about so many aspects of human-animal behavior. He paused again. I'm not proud of that. I was arrogant and high-minded. The problem was that Mal was too, but even more intensely. Sometimes nothing happened all class hour except for us conducting a shouting match while the rest of the class watched the entertainment. I don't know why I let him get under my skin so frequently. And the worst part is, I tried to use the writings against him. Against him? He shrugged guiltily. I had been studying them, and at times I was filled with righteous pride for all I thought I knew. Guess what? Righteous and pride don't go together. I'd throw phrases from the writings at Mal as if they were balls of mud, leaving both of us filthy. It took me a few years to realize the writings aren't meant to be used as a vengeful weapon, but as a guiding tool. The Creator isn't trying to punish us, He's trying to warn us. But I wasn't mature enough to understand that 7 years ago. So I'd counter every comment and argument Mal made by quoting some passage at him, with a tone that removed all tenderness and replaced it with malice. I think you're being a little hard on yourself. She patted his firm chest, and he didn't seem to mind that her hand remained there. I'm sure he realized you're immature. I know I've said some things I've regretted when provoked in just the right way. He smiled faintly. Sorry about that. And Nicomel is a mature man, right? He pondered. Interesting question. Supposedly he is. But I've often wondered, why did he let me annoy him? He truly hated me. I could see it in his eyes. Even just last year, when I ran into him, his hand that wasn't around Mari suddenly clapped on his leg to signal an end to that memory. Well, all of that was a long time ago. We've both moved on, I'm sure. It's just that he struggled to find the most diplomatic way to say it. Chairman Mal's not entirely forthcoming about everything. I see, Mari said slowly. That was vague enough to be misunderstood, but clear enough that I get the idea. When was the last time you received a weather report from your father? Right before our first debate. He wrote, "Children of Idemia know the sky is blue, thanks to improvements suggested by our administrators." Clever. Should anyone else happen to read that, they'll not hear the sarcastic tone with which it was undoubtedly penned. And my father is the master of the sarcastic tone, Perrin acknowledged. Now I understand more why you accepted the color of the sky debate. Perrin turned a little pink, much to Mari's surprise. The moment I saw you, I thought to myself, this just might be a woman worth getting to know. Then I cursed Hogel for making me think I was about to debate the village spinster. But I needed to know how you thought and felt. That night you argued everything precisely in line with my own beliefs. A woman who claimed that the sky wasn't even blue, but inherently black? Well, some part of me knew right then I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. And I believe I cursed Hogel a second time for setting me up like that. He pursed his lips as he remembered. Again, Mari couldn't help herself, planting a kiss there which Perrin heartily accepted. She pulled away just inches from his face. We'll have to tell Hogel that we forgive him, she whispered. I think asking him to perform the ceremony might accomplish that, he whispered back. There will be a ceremony, right? She grinned. Negotiations seem to be leaning toward that end, don't they? He kissed her again in answer. After 2 hours of exhaustive discussion, covering what they figured to be at least 3 moons' worth of courting information, Perrin and Mari left out the back door again, and Mari locked it without his prompting. Hogel had told Perrin when the performance at the amphitheater would be ending, and the captain of the fort needed to make an announcement while the villagers were still there. The plan was for Perrin to go back to the fort, change into his uniform, then take a horse for the amphitheater in time for the announcement. Mari would meet him there and would, in the meantime, walk to the center of the village alone. That was what bothered Perrin as he stood on her back porch. It's just not a good idea, Mari. Alone? As I've done for years, she reminded him. But it's already dark. He gestured to the obvious evidence. I know, but you've trained your soldiers for this, right? Already they're patrolling the village. Look, 2 more right over there on the main road. At that, Perrin stepped back to her back porch and out of all possible view of the soldiers. Mari elbowed him. Someday they're going to find out about us. He took her by the shoulders and pulled her close to him. I suppose they are. He kissed her. And I suppose they should know something right now. Abruptly, he stepped off the porch, pulling her along by her arm. He walked so fast to the back alley and over to the main road that Mari had to trot to keep up with him. Privates! Perrin bellowed, and the soldiers walking away from them. Obviously startled, the 2 young men jumped, spun, and faced their commander. The swords strapped to their sides caught up a moment later, slapping awkwardly against their legs. Remarkably, the soldiers didn't wince, but saluted smartly. Well, one started to wince, likely thinking the dark night hid his pained expression. But the torch he carried gave him away. Mari stifled a chuckle, and Perrin grumbled quietly as they neared. All right, I'm still training many of them, he whispered to Mari. Clumsy things. In a louder voice he said, Men, I need you to escort Miss Pato to the amphitheater. As I'm sure you're aware, this isn't a time for anyone to be walking unattended. Of course, sir. said one of the young men briskly. Oddly, Mari felt like laughing. Seeing the slightly terrified but completely obedient response of the soldiers to her future husband was rather impressive. For some reason, it hadn't occurred to her that men in blue uniforms would snap to attention in his presence. Maybe because she didn't. It struck her as rather comical in a daunting sort of way. 15 minutes later, Mari arrived safely and successfully at the amphitheater. She was not successful, however, in engaging the soldiers, large boys of not yet 20 years old, in any kind of conversation. They just marched stoically on either side of her, answering her questions in the briefest of ways. And she tried to remind herself she wasn't their prisoner on the way to visit the administrator of loyalty. They followed her to the back entrance of the amphitheater. She stopped at one of the sets of stairs that led up to the platform and dismissed them. Or tried to. As you can see, I'm now here, so shoo, off with you. Well done, privates. They tipped their caps to her, but didn't move. We're to remain here, ma'am. Captain's orders. He wanted to introduce many of us tonight to the villagers. Mari glanced around and saw that many more pairs of soldiers were coming to the amphitheater, also carrying torches. There must have been over 70 of them, and she understood why. Edgers would be understandably nervous to hear that grasses had been attacked. When they left the amphitheater, seeing dozens of soldiers ready and waiting to help them home, even lighting the way, would be most comforting. Mari smiled. She was marrying a most clever man. And thinking of clever men, she heard the horse trotting toward her in the darkness before she saw it. The gray beast came all the way up to the back entrance and was reined to a stop by Captain Shin. She couldn't help but grin at him in his full uniform, with his sword strapped securely to his side. Yes, he would protect Edge. But he only tipped his cap in formal response to her. Miss Vidoe, glad to see you arrived safely, he said as he got off his horse and handed the reins to one of Mari's soldiers. Mari immediately erased her goofy grin and adopted an equally reserved demeanor. Yes, thank you, Captain. Your men did quite well. Keeping their intentions to Mary secret for just one more day was difficult. No wonder her mother wailed in grief when they told her to not spread the gossip until after tonight's announcement. Even Heisemum didn't know what was coming, but she was in the audience, eagerly waiting. Captain Shin nodded briefly to Mari and surveyed his assembled soldiers. As I instructed, post yourselves at the exits, he told them. We will be escorting as many as we need to, for however long we need to tonight. Win their hearts and minds, men. If Edgers don't trust us, we've already lost the battle. As the soldiers dispersed, except for a dozen assigned to that exit, Captain Shin glanced back at Mari and winked at her. She covered her mouth with her hand to avoid smiling in front of the remaining soldiers. Captain Shin wasn't making this any easier. A roar of laughter, then loud applause, came from the platform beyond and drifted down to those waiting behind. I've seen this play before, Mari told Captain Shin and the soldiers. By the laughter, I can tell it's the final scene and should be over in just a couple of minutes. You best get into position, Captain. Thank you, Miss Vidoe, he said stiffly, then walked to the stairs and waited for his cue from Rector Densel. Mari slipped around to the front of the platform and suddenly took a spot at the end of a nearly full bench. The villagers were too involved enjoying the play to notice her arrival, and when the actors left the platform, all of the audience stood to applaud. Rector Densel quickly made his way to the platform and held up his hands. Thank you for your attendance this evening, he called as loudly as he could. Please, we have one more item tonight. If you'd all just sit back down. 5 minutes, that's all. His voice was drowned out in the crowd's noise of gathering up blankets, children in bags, and jostling to be the first to get out. Mari wrung her hands worriedly in her lap until she saw Captain Shin stride onto the platform and march right up to the edge of it. The movement caused a few people to stop and look up. Hey, it's Captain Shin! Back for more punishing debates? Someone called loudly. What, wanting more humiliation, Captain? Cried out another voice. The evening's performance had left Edgers in a particularly jolly and stupidly brave mood, Mari thought sadly. That was all about to change. Captain Shin stood solidly at the front of the platform, large, forbidding, and intriguing. More edgers were stopping their movements to watch him for any. All he did was nod once to his great-uncle, who made his way back down the stairs. Then the commander of the fort repositioned himself with his feet slightly apart, with his hands behind his back, and a fixed glare on the crowd of nearly 4,000. Mari felt goosebumps rise in her arms as she watched her future husband, stern and imposing, make men more than twice his age suddenly feel the need to sit down and hold very still. Within seconds, the entire audience was silently taking their seats again. Incredible, Mari thought. He may never want to be a general, but he certainly carried the blood and bearing of generals. Then again, Mari realized she'd never met a general before, so she wasn't sure exactly how one would convey himself. But edgers hadn't either, and they were fascinated by the officers standing in front of them, waiting for them to come to order as if they were in a classroom of disruptive teenagers. As the amphitheater hushed to silent anticipation, Captain Shin stood stock still for yet another agonizing 10 seconds. Mari almost chuckled. Classic debating tactic. Work the crowd, get them begging for you to say something, anything. She'd have to keep a close eye on this one, she thought to herself. Villagers of Edge, Captain Shin's deep voice finally boomed to the crowd. Everyone shrank on their benches. I am here to inform you that the night before last, the village of Grasses experienced an attack by garters. The gasp wasn't just audible, but tangible. You should be scared, Mari thought in satisfaction, and grateful my future husband is here. She had to stop thinking things like that. It made her want to smile, and that was rather inappropriate right now. Captain Shin waited for the hushed murmurs to quiet before he continued. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of parchment. A short time ago, I received this update from the colonel commanding the fort in Grasses. The garters were, unfortunately, very effective in reaching into the very center of Grasses. In total, 14 houses were hit, 13 citizens and soldiers lost their lives, and more than 30 were injured. Not one edger said a word. All of their mouths were hanging open far too wide. Mari sighed. Perrin had already shared those numbers with her, but they still sounded so awful. She couldn't remember an attack in the past 30 years that caused so much damage in one place. You may be comforted to know that 9 garters were also killed by the army of Idamea. Captain Shin continued, sounding both terrifying and consoling. Members of that same army are now standing outside this amphitheater with torches ready. Should you feel the need to be accompanied by a couple of strong soldiers armed with swords and long knives, please feel free to take my men home with you, with my compliments. He smiled ever so slightly. The audience ate that up, breaking into grins far broader than they should be for such a subtle touch of humor. But they were eager for any kind of break to the instant gloom that overshadowed them. You will also notice that, effectively immediately, the army of Idamea will be patrolling your roads and alleys to keep you safe, and the garters in the forests where they belong. Mari didn't expect the crowd to break out into applause, but they did, even adding a few cheers and whoops. Perhaps they didn't know what kind of response was appropriate, Mari considered, so they tried a little bit of everything. Captain Shin's eyes wandered over the grateful crowd, stopping briefly when he met Mari's. She winked at him in encouragement. He did nothing, but looked at her intently for a moment longer before turning his attention back to the villagers. I recommend, he said loudly over the noise, which rapidly quieted again, that you now gather your things, your children, and make your ways home in large groups. The army will assist you as needed. I also recommend that you remember how to work the locks on your doors. Now is not a good time to become an easy target. Good night. He shifted his stance just a little, and suddenly the audience rose up as one body and made a mad, but orderly, dash for the exits. Mari let the village stream past her so she could observe the captain as he watched the crowd with falcon-like alertness. It wasn't until that evening that she realized just how duplicitous he could be, but in a good way. He was both intimidating and compassionate, unapproachable but concerned. A few people paused at the platform to call up words of thanks to him. He'd nod curtly and offer half a brief smile before scanning the area again. Mari could tell no one was quite sure how to react to the captain, who wasn't there tonight to be the object of their teasing, but to be the preserver of their safety. And they were glad he was. Once Captain Shin was sure the villagers were well on their way home, he walked down the stairs into the front and over to his great-aunt and uncle. Mari could only catch glimpses of the three of them in conversation as Edgers hurried past her. But suddenly both Tabit and Hogle Densel looked over at Mari. Not sure what Perrin had said to them, she smiled and waved hesitantly. That time Perrin did wink at her and put a hand on each of the Densels' shoulders. She saw his lips form the words, "We'll be at your place in about 10 minutes then." The Densels stared at each other as the captain gently pushed his way through the thinning crowd to Mari. And then she wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe it was to appear to Edgers that he wasn't an entirely terrifying authority figure, but also just a gentleman. Perhaps it was to give Edgers something else to think about rather than the fact that garters were indeed active again. Or maybe he thought Heisem and Pato wouldn't be effective enough in the morning. But for whatever reason it was, he smiled at Mari and offered her his arm. She raised her eyebrows at him in surprise, but happily linked her hand into the crook of his elbow and allowed him to escort her out of the amphitheater, to the astonishment of everyone. Tuma Hafati, the old faded man, shuffled over to his front door and opened it. "Hughlisse, what can I do for you?" The man in his 50s smiled at Tuma. "I have news that I thought you'd be interested in." "About our captain?" Hugh nodded. "A few mornings ago, he walked into the forest." Tuma's eyebrows shot upwards. "Then he walked right back out again," Hugh said, disappointed. "Ah," Tuma smiled, "but why did he enter the forest, Hugh?" "It seems he wanted to discover something or prove something." "Interesting, interesting. And why did he leave again?" "Pressure from his officers. They both escorted him back to the fort." Tuma rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "In to discover something. Out because of pressure." He pondered for a moment. "Hugh, increase the patrols over Edge. Keep a closer eye on this one. In to discover something," he muttered as he turned around and shuffled back into his office. "In to discover." "I think it's safe to say the entire village knows," Mari said to Perrin 2 nights later as they ate dinner. "I found these slipped under my door this afternoon." She slid a few small notes across the table to him. He picked them up, made a face at the writing where each I was dotted with a flower, and said, "One of your students? She has interesting ideas for debate topics, doesn't she? Baby names? People debate about that?" "I don't know. I never had the experience." They were from Serene, I'm sure. I heard giggling by the door moments before I heard the knock. Perrin put down the slips. "I think your evaluation is correct. I've been getting looks from everyone in the village and the fort. You know, the look?" He made his eyes large, accentuated with raised eyebrows. Mari laughed. "Yes, I know that look. I received quite a bit of it at the market this morning." "Your mother is a most efficient news spreader," Perrin decided. "We call them gossips, and they'd all visit Edge's Inn when my mother's working." I was trying to be diplomatic. "Well done," Mari nodded in approval. "But I think you walking me out of the amphitheater the other night in front of nearly the entire village may have contributed to chatter." "Well, the news had to get started somehow," he said dismissively, as if he just did her a tremendous favor but really didn't need so much thanks. Mari rolled her eyes. "So is the gossip why you snuck into the back door today?" Perrin shrugged. "Just a slightly faster way to get to your house." So you're not taking the back alleys just to avoid my neighbors? Because you realize they'll soon be your neighbors. I suppose we can be seen together in other places too, he said. Well, we can't avoid it forever. They'll be making faces at us for a few more days, and then the novelty will wear off. Edgers are skilled at finding new targets. Everyone already knows I adore you. I'm sure my mother has made that clear. He grinned. And I guess I should admit that my soldiers have been giving me subtle smiles. I suppose I can't blame that all on your mother. Mari laughed. You might. She has connections everywhere. She's a good resource. You may have to start talking to her just to know what's going on in the village. I'll try, he bravely promised. I'm going over to her home tomorrow to learn, to cook, she confessed. You could come over after your shift to my mother's. Is that really necessary? He scowled, not too diplomatically. Do you want to risk eating Blob? She's going to teach me how to make bouillon and dim sum and gelatin. He squinted. What are those? She shrugged. I'm not sure myself. I never eat at the inn. I can't understand her menu. Please? Of course, he smiled when he saw her sincere worry. Thanks. And since I spent the morning learning more about your family, it's only fitting that you spend an evening getting to know mine. Of course, he repeated offhandedly, picking up a chicken leg. He stopped. Wait, what? I had visitors this morning for a couple of hours, she said as she slowly buttered a slice of bread. Does the name Auntie Tabbitt sound familiar? But, he blinked rapidly, we told Hogel and Tabbitt everything after the announcement at the amphitheater. What more could there be to discuss? Oh, there's lots to tell about. Oh, how did Auntie Tabbitt phrase it? The most adorable little boy with the biggest brown eyes ever to be seen. Mari batted her eyelashes at him. Oh, no, he whispered. She laughed again. It wasn't that bad. He rubbed his forehead. Understand, they never had children. I was the closest thing they had, kind of their grandson, I guess, especially after my mother's parents died. I only saw them a few times when I was younger, and they traveled to the forts where my father was posted. Whatever they said, please realize that. But Mari was still laughing. They just told me how sweet you were when you were little, that's all. Goodness, you look like you're afraid they revealed some horrible secrets about you. He watched her intently. It's just, never quite sure how others will remember incidents from your past. Maybe I need to ask them for more details. That's not necessary, he assured. So what else did they talk about? Actually, I heard a few more interesting things about your parents, she said with a deliberate look. He paled. Oh, no. Relax, will you? I feel a bit better now. Tabbitt obviously loves her niece. She went on and on about Joriana this and Joriana that, but I must admit it sounds as if she's a bit more sophisticated than anything an edge, she hinted. Perrin nodded. I told you that, sort of. But don't worry, she's great. She'll love you. Huh, Mari said, unconvinced. Tabbitt said that too, but we'll see. So did Tabbitt or Hogel say anything about my father? Mari nodded gravely. Your father wants to be buried standing up and at attention when he dies. Perrin snorted. According to Hogel, Mari clarified. Yeah, that sounds like Hogel. He and my father, well, father doesn't read the writings as often as Hogel thinks he should, and Hogel is too narrow-minded to give father any really good advice. That's pretty much how every conversation between them goes. She cringed. Should be an interesting wedding ceremony. Don't worry, they're more civil now than they used to be. Now it's just a thing the two of them go through. Neither really agrees with the other, but they respect each other. And for that, I admire them both. Mari bit her lower lip. My parents are great, really. Perrin nodded and took a bite of chicken to avoid discussing the matter further. The professor, lecturing in basic command tactics, stumbled over his words when he saw the door to the classroom unexpectedly open. Each of the first-year command students looked over at the door and sucked in his breath. Don't mind me, the white-haired man in the red coat smiled amiably. Just had a few minutes, was feeling nostalgic, and decided to sit in again on some of my favorite classes. See what's changed in the few years since I've taught here. Please, go on. The professor paled, looking back down at his notes to see where he was, and began haltingly, trying to ignore that Chairman Nico Mal was taking an empty seat on the side of the room. Slowly, the faces of his students, the future officers of the army of Idumea, turned back to the professor and dutifully took notes. Chairman Mal continued to wear his thin smile and nodded at points the professor made about planning and preparation. When the class ended, mercifully only 5 minutes after the chairman arrived, the young men stood at attention, saluted their professor as he exited, then gathered their books while keeping the chairman in their peripheral vision. He was watching one new student, a young man who entered midterm but had caught up to be on track with the rest of them. As the soldiers filed out of the room, Mal gestured to the remaining young man who would shape up into a useful dog with the proper training. Lieutenant Heth, the uniform suits you. You look much better than you did several weeks ago in my office. Thank you, sir, the former son of Orem began. I appreciate that you... Mal held up a hand to stop him. Don't be sloppy, he whispered in a quiet warning. Heth paled and nodded. Yes, sir. What can I do for you, sir? Mal stood up and clasped his hands behind his back. Just checking in on my future officers. Like to step in every now and then, question a few here and there, make them know what I expect and see that they're up to the challenge. Heth straightened even more. I assure you, Chairman, that I am up to any challenge you may issue. Mal nodded. Very good, Lieutenant. In about 2 years, once you've completed your education, which is being provided for you at an extraordinary cost, which I'm sure I don't have to remind you, I shall have some exceptional challenges for you. Until then, know that I will frequently check on you, as I check on all of my special cases. Heth's eyebrows furrowed, either at the news that he could expect future visits, or that he wasn't the only one. Yes, sir. Any news on your brother's whereabouts? Mal whispered. None, sir. Mal nodded once. You have another class to attend, soldier. Best not be late. Heth saluted, grabbed his books, and headed out the door to his next class. Mal waited in the classroom for the next batch of students. A few moments later, several young men filed in, each hesitating at the door as he recognized the chairman. One young man stopped completely, then cleared his throat and nodded almost imperceptibly to Mal. The chairman nodded back, smiled that the message was received so quickly by the smarter dog, and left the room, much to the relief of the professor who was about to enter it. Lieutenant Heth enjoyed stretching his legs and taking in the sights of Idumea. He allowed himself a break since he was ahead of schedule in command school, because of a tutor and a few pages of test pages. With the right papers signed by the right people, with the right extensions of the truth, even a failed assassin could find himself with a new name, history, years of enlisted army service, and the honor of the pre-commission title of lieutenant for his exemplary past work. He loved Idumea, where reality never interfered with one's ambitions. He strode around the grand city, purposely taking the long route to make sure no one could discern his final destination. With his cap pulled down, he walked casually up to the grand gates of the place he used to call home. 2 more soldiers, dressed like him, manned the gates but made no motion to open them for him. 8 years ago they would have, given the little king anything he wanted. No one outside the mansion called him that, though, because he wasn't legitimate. His mother said it was because she wasn't in any hurry to marry Orem. Then one night when he was 17, his mother roused him and his 13-year-old brother from their sleep, told them to pack lightly, and whisked them away to her aunt's house in Scrub. She said everything was their stupid, senseless father's fault. But he loved his father. Sure, he was a little slow, but that wasn't reason enough to kill him, was it? Lieutenant Heth strolled past the mansion's entrance, remembering how he and his brother used to shoot arrows at each other in the long grand hall. Dorman was far sneakier than any boy should be, and was never hit. But if they met in that hallway now, Heth would pierce his traitorous brother in the heart. His skills with the bow were improving every day. Heth stopped past the gates and sighed, looking up through the iron bars at the two-story stone mansion where the high traitor now lived. He didn't deserve those bedrooms or that grand staircase where Heth had frequently taken the mattresses from the maids' rooms and slid down the stairs. He killed his father and didn't care that his mother died poor and bitter and scrub. He poisoned his brother into believing the lies the rest of the world told about their father and family. Dorman was the most devoted idiot High General Shin didn't even know he had. As Heth looked longingly at the tall chimneys rising out of the mansion, he remembered the last conversation with his brother. "You've got it all wrong, son of Oren," Dorman had tried to tell him after they buried their mother more than 8 moons ago. They walked through the burial grounds alone to the small house where their aunt had let them stay. "Our father really was useless. I've read all the books and talked to some who served under him. He was just a stupid man, completely ill-equipped to lead anything more than a goat to pasture." "How dare you!" son of Oren had exclaimed. "He was our father, the fifth in line of great leaders." Dorman sighed and scratched his head. "You sounded a lot like great-grandmother there. And she wasn't just occasionally scary, she was downright evil. Have you heard of the killing squads? They were her idea, son of Oren. Honestly, I'm glad we're out of there. The only thing I wish now was that I didn't look so much like them. You're lucky you got Mother's face. But me? I'll never be able to go near Idemia. Too many people still remember what they looked like." Heth had stared at his brother, who was broader-shouldered and a bit taller than him, much like their father, with similar straw-colored hair and gravel-pale skin. "What have they done to you? Who's poisoned your mind?" Dorman smiled sadly. "Every history book in the world. You should try reading sometime. It's a very humbling pursuit. Next, I'm going to crack open the writings. For as much as great-grandmother hated them, I simply must know what's in there." "I'll never understand you." Heth shook his head. "You sound like you don't even miss the life we had." "I don't," Dorman exclaimed. "Not after I discovered what our comfort did to the rest of the world. Son of Oren, if I could fix any of that, I would. And we should. It's our responsibility to reverse all of that." "I'm planning on it," Heth had promised darkly. "Really? How?" Heth didn't answer him, knowing his brother would only punch holes into his idea. "Oh, no, you can't be serious." "I didn't say anything," Heth shrugged. "But I know you. When my dog attacked your cat, you killed my dog," Dorman said bitterly. "No one but you would have ever called that animal a dog," Heth said steadily. "More like a deformed rat. It deserved to die." Dorman took a couple of steps away from him. "Yes, son of Oren, you're definitely the offspring of our great-grandparents. You're going to do something you think is noble, then justify it in some easy way. You're going to try to kill Chairman Mal or someone. And when I do, don't you come back looking for a bedroom in Idemia." "Oh, I won't, son of Oren. I'll stay as far away from you as possible, just like I avoided great-grandmother." That was the last time son of Oren Heth had seen him. He left that night heading south with a butcher knife in his waistband and a determination to rid the world of a certain professor. But now he had better plans. What Dorman the doormat was doing now, Heth didn't care. He stared at the mansion he was going to retake and smiled. Some day, when he would be there hosting a grand dinner, and his starving brother would come limping back to beg a chicken wing to nibble on, Heth would greet him with a bow and arrow, or maybe a jagged dagger. In either case, Dorman would never spend the night in the mansion again. That is the end of Chapter 14. Thank you.